Full disclosure, I received a Steam review key for this game, so I did not pay for it. This won't be influencing my analysis at all, but it's important to be transparent. Life Eater is the latest release from Strange Scaffold, who have also developed El Paso Elsewhere, Space Warlord Oregon Trading Simulator, and an airport for aliens currently run by dogs. For the purpose of this review, I played the game 2 separate times, once before major updates and once after. Before the updates, I was much more mixed on the game, but after sitting on it for a bit and the majority of my major complaints being addressed, I now think the game, while having a few flaws, is overall a solid horror experiment that is worth your time. So what is this game? Life Eater bills itself as a horror fantasy kidnapping simulator, where you need to serve a possibly false god by sacrificing victims to prevent the end of the world year by year. Along the way, the game also explores the development of a parasocial relationship between the main character Ralph and Johnny, a man he kidnaps and keeps locked in his basement for 10 years. So let's first discuss the gameplay. Primarily, Life Eater's gameplay loops involves you stalking specific victims in order to gain enough information on them to kidnap them, along with needing to perform a ritual in a specific way based on what you've learned. The game takes place on a video editing interface, with the timeline for the week presented and specific nodes denoting actions a victim will take. To gather the information you need, you have to reveal nodes using actions, which will use up your remaining time and can accrue suspicion. If the meter increases too far, you'll be spotted and get a strike, with 3 strikes and you're out. To help balance this, you also get access to anonymous points by performing positive actions, which lets you do a reveal action without adding any suspicion. All this makes for a game focused on time management, collecting information, and puzzle solving. Quite a few of the victims you interact with have complex schedules, and there can even be multiple people on the timeline to track at any given time. Now, pre-patch, a major issue with the sacrifice ceremony was that it was copy and pasted, meaning all 10 victims required the same information, which made it very easy to brute force and meant it was very easy to not engage with the game on its own terms. Post-patch, this has been corrected, with individual victims requiring specific information that is often exclusive to them. Regardless, there is semi-randomization with basic information on a victim per run, so you have to carefully consider every detail and take a lot of notes. In my case, I took literal physical notes on index cards so I didn't need to continually tab out. Now, I do have issues still with the gameplay loop, but on the whole, I think it serves its purpose of getting you into Ralph's perspective pretty well without glorifying or glossing over his actions. By having the people you interact with be ever-shifting and indistinct, it shows how Ralph deliberately depersonalizes and pretty literally objectifies his victims for what he feels he needs to do. At the same time, the metatextual actions you take have a pretty real effect on the player, at least for me. Every time I needed to do the flower ceremony, I felt physically sick doing so, which is actually extremely rare for me to ever feel while playing a horror game, so kudos to that. The issues I take with this primarily come down to parts of the interface honestly being a bit confusing, along with some ludonarrative stuff. For instance, the game doesn't directly tell you how the anonymous points function as of yet. While it's easy enough to figure out on your own, I find it odd that the tutorial doesn't even mention them. The time up on the screen is a form of a resource, which is fine, but it's initially a bit odd due to a lack of feedback on what you're doing, since every level in the game will always display a full week, which obviously leads to the question of how Ralph is able to knock on a door on Friday if the world ends on like Tuesday or something. Of course, in terms of design space and bouncing, this is an understandable concession to make, since if the video timelines were completely synced up with your time resource, it could become pretty messy and unmanageable pretty fast. Another odd feature of the game is the randomization of stalking actions based on when you click a node. What you do in the 3 stages of suspicious actions are randomized, along with the amount of time you take. This can create some pretty odd situations if you try reading the gameplay as story. For instance, being able to catfish an 87-year-old man who is in a coma, along with him being depicted on screen as standing up looking at his phone. Huh? Well, as I just explained, I understand the purpose, the depersonalization of individual victims, and how that contributes to Ralph's mental state. On the whole, I wish that a lot of the gameplay was more specific, with more reactivity based on what you actually do to someone. For instance, pink actions are free actions which reveal unique parts of a victim's timeline, but it's fully possible to find the results of an action you do before you even do the thing that causes it. Free actions as an idea I think is fine, since it gives a specific thing Ralph does to someone a logical cause and effect, but the implementation makes it feel about the same as any other action. Perhaps it would work better if a node was fully locked down from being interacted with, and you had to pick a specific action to unlock it. For instance, choosing to be on lookout on a specific day to see a meeting at the docks. This would obviously make the game much more complicated to program, but would contribute greatly to understanding cause and effect and how Ralph is directly hurting his victims, similar to guided story actions you can undertake in a Hitman game versus doing things freeform. As it is now, sometimes when you click on a node, it will not be revealed because you didn't pick an action with a high enough suspicion level, with very little understanding of why that is the case since every node looks the exact same aside from length of time elapsed. I've seen other critiques of Life Eater that say the gameplay is overall repetitive, and while I can absolutely understand the argument that stalking victims shouldn't feel positive to play, I think a lot of those critiques just come down to a lack of feedback from the game itself, either positive or negative, which I think should be addressed. Now I want to discuss the game's overarching story of Ralph and Johnny. This section will contain full spoilers for that, so if you're interested in playing the game first or want to watch a Let's Play or something, feel free to avoid. Pretty early in the game, Ralph kidnaps Johnny, the overall reason as to why being left unstated, but I think I have an answer that makes sense to me.
It's... right?
You saw me?
Nice to see you again.
No one sees me. This is...
Have a good one.
This is bad.
Ralph is shocked that Johnny is able to see him, which I read as he's shocked Johnny remembers him enough to wish him well after he goes shopping. While it's notable that this is in the context of a literal financial transaction, it's a small bit of kindness Ralph isn't used to that exposes the black hole his heart has become from the things he's done. Over time, he develops a pretty strange parasocial friendship with Johnny very slowly being broken down over the years due to him being trapped just so Ralph can continue to feel seen. Now for Zimforth, the game never confirms or denies if they're real or not, but the emotional and psychological effects on Ralph are still real regardless, and a lot of the ways in which Ralph acts is symptomatic of people who have hardcore depression, social anxiety, and in some cases DID. This is not to say any of those factors are why he kills if Zimforth is truly not real, and I don't think the game is implying that regardless, just that why Ralph wants Johnny to be with him is heavily related to that. Mental illness and trauma is extremely isolating and numbing, and having a candle to that darkness can feel like hell. Over time, Johnny begins to believe that Zimforth is real as well, partially spurred on by an earthquake happening once he convinces Ralph to try to not do the yearly sacrifice, and this leads to them relating to each other in the horrors of their situation, despite the fact that the dynamic is a victim with his kidnapper. The power imbalance between them never goes away, but Johnny becoming a more willing participant feels like it upsets that balance. This type of writing is pretty interesting to me in fictional stories, and it's also why I like the writing in El Paso Elsewhere. It's able to explore complex questions of morality and agency without being harmful to real-life people. Perhaps the most interesting part of the game is the final year, where Zimforth tells Ralph to sacrifice Johnny, and through the gameplay you have to choose whether you'll do so or choose to have Ralph sacrifice himself, with some varying endings depending on the choice. Neither ending is a particularly happy one, although the one where Johnny survives seems a lot more optimistic due to the fact that regardless of what happens, the cycle of violence has ended. Whereas if Ralph sacrifices Johnny, the implication is he will never break from Zimforth's control. Overall, I think the story is fairly well written and presented, although I do have a few nitpicks. Mainly, I think the pacing of Ralph and Johnny's relationship is inconsistent with the year basis the game's structure is built on. It feels like the events of the game should have happened over the course of maybe 1 year, which is particularly noticeable when Johnny asked for headphones before his sacrifice like 5 years into being kidnapped. I also question why there is no third ending to the game where you wait out the timer and don't sacrifice anyone, or potentially variant endings depending on if you do the sacrifice ritual successfully or not. I understand not confirming or denying Zimforth's reality, but there's absolutely space for an ending where both Ralph and Johnny accept that staying alive could mean the end of the world, but they ultimately have each other to see it through. By not having this ending, it does ultimately imply Zimforth is real, since why else would you be getting a game over for not doing what they say, which unintentionally changes the intended reading of the text. That said, I think this game is a very careful examination of complex topics that is able to avoid a lot of writing tropes that stigmatize people with mental illness, without supporting serial killers and their actions in the process. I recommend Life Eater as a short-form horror experience. The subject matter and gameplay certainly isn't for everyone, but if you give the game a fair shake, I'm sure you'll find something there that is interesting. The game's only about $15 and it gets discounted frequently in bundles and sales and all that, so pick it up if that seems like something you're interested in. With that said, see y'all later.